Good evening. Welcome to No BS Woodworking, and this is Tuesday Tips. I am Chuck Bender. I appreciate you coming. Apologize for my froggy voice here. This is a very persistent cold. It was really bad last week, which is why I postponed, and I thought I was over it. And yesterday afternoon, during a class, my voice went from normal. If you watch any of the other videos, if you can call that normal, it went to this yesterday in the afternoon and hasn't recovered yet. So I am trying. We're using a streaming service to get to YouTube this week. It seems to be at this point holding fairly well as far as I can tell. I can see a few people in the chat, and hopefully you guys can hear me just fine. Please, somebody say so. Voice is loud and clear. Thank you, Charles. That's always good. No matter where I go here now, hopefully the sound follows me. Although I'm not going anywhere tonight, we're going to kind of deal with the right tilt table saw. And I have just as a video production thing, when I talk about a right tilt saw, it is going to tilt to my right. So on the camera, it would be going to your left. Usually, and that's really the subject of tonight's discussion, is right tilt table saws, their advantages and disadvantages. So this saw tilts to my right. So when I'm standing in front of the saw as though I'm using it, the blade tilts to my right. The other thing I want to say right up front is I have the guards removed from this saw for video purposes only. Please, when you're operating your saws, keep your riving knife and your guards all in place. If I do that today, you won't see anything that's happening, and that's not good. So if I look at the saw, the function or the functionality of a right tilt saw from 90% of what I do, which is ripping and straight cross cutting, isn't really any different than a left tilt saw. And that's what we'll talk about next week. I'll show you my left tilt saw and some of the advantages and disadvantages of that. So if you're looking to buy a table saw in the near future, or you have one, these are some of the kind of things that you'll be able to look for. If regular cross-cutting and regular ripping really isn't any different, why pick one over the other? And to me, it all boils down to certain operations are safer on a right tilt saw, and other operations are safer on a left tilt saw. So I'm going to run through a couple of those right now without trying to take away what I'm going to talk about next week. So we're going to make this short because I don't know how long my voice will last. As I said, if you can see, the saw is in the 90-degree position at the moment. So regular cross cutting with this, whether I'm using the slider, this is my Hammer K3, whether I'm using a slider or a sled, there's really not a whole lot of difference. Where the main difference for cross cutting comes in is if I'm cutting moldings, cutting miters on moldings and things like that. If I tilt this over at 45, and let me switch cameras real quick. Camera button, please. There we go. So if I switch over to, the other camera and bring you guys in as I tilt this over to 45, you can see it is tilting away from the camera. And the great thing about this particular saw is I have a couple of marks back here at the beginning that show me the inside and outside cut of my blade. So what I did was I made a regular cross cut, and I brought the material back and then scribed off where the left and the right side of the blade is on the entry of my saw, so that I can very rapidly line up a mark and make a trim cut. Because of the way this saw is made, and it's not necessarily true on all right tilt saws, but because of the way this saw is made, this part of the blade, everything stays in that same plane. So I can line up, if I'm going to mark, pardon me, give me a second, folks. If I am going to mark a 45 on my molding to make a cut, I don't know if you can see that on camera or not, but I just marked it on there. I can bring the saw back, or bring the material back, turn on the saw, make the cut, and I'm still lining up with those same points. Okay, you can shut off now. Pardon me. All right. So you can see, to me, the safety aspect is what's most important here. As I have this tilted over, but it's not getting any better, is it? That voice. This cold is just hanging in there. Just when you think you're out, it pulls you back in. I always wanted to say that on camera. So as I'm cutting, again, I can line my cut up with the marks I have here, make the cut, so I can make very accurate cuts. Again, that's particular to this saw, not necessarily to all right tilt saws. To me, like I said, the important part of this is that there's a safety factor here. If I have a left tilt saw and I'm using a slider, I have to make sure that the miter gauge is far enough out of the way that no matter how thick the material I'm cutting, I'm not going to cut into my miter gauge, which also means that I have to hold my material farther away from the blade in order to keep it tight against the fence, which means I'm going to stand a chance of having this thing bounce around a little bit. You know, when I made that cut now, I tend to like to keep my hands fairly close to the blade and make the cut. So having the blade tilt away from you really makes a difference in your ability to make the cut without encroaching on your fingers, which is a huge deal. So that leads me to my next step, which would be how to rip. And so positive is for a right tilt saw. If I'm using the miter gauge, a sled, the slider, having a right tilt saw allows me to make those miters, whether it's feet or crown molding or anything like that, very safely and very accurately, because the blade is tilting away from me and I don't have to keep my hands. I can keep my hands closer to the blade and make sure that that material is held fast. All right. We've got John Wayne in the house. All right. If I'm ripping, the problem becomes most people's rip fences are usually taller than they are wide. So if I'm trying to rip something kind of narrow here on an angle, with that saw tilted, I have virtually no room to get a push stick or anything else in there in order to make the cut safely. This is actually, it's also trapping that material between the blade, the table, and the fence. So it's not in any way what I would consider the safest option possible. And I'll switch the camera so I can get it a little tighter on that. In fact, I'm going to move the camera around to here. Maybe we'll take it back on the other side. Sorry. It's live woodworking, folks, not edited for your viewing pleasure, clearly. So you can see what I'm saying. If I, if I'm trying to rip something real narrow to make small pieces, this really just isn't going to work in a safe fashion. Yeah, I'm fading fast here, folks. One of the things that this saw does really well is if I've made my miters and I want to put splines in there, what I have is a tenoning jig that will hold that material up. Yeah. Looks like the tenoning jig took a tumble. And for this saw, because it's got this extruded fence here, what you're going to see, if I can get the camera to stay in one position, one position would be fine, is I have a jig, a tenoning jig that has it wraps around the flag on the top of that and holds my piece vertically. So if I've cut a miter, say I'm making a box and I want to run a spline this way to assemble the box, I can then move the camera, widen up the shot a little bit. Bring it over, line it up, and make my cut for my spline. That, I think, is an advantage for a right tilt saw. The trapping the material between the blade, the table, and the fence, a definite disadvantage. Particularly, like I said, if you're trying to rip narrow strips, now there's no way to keep it parallel, up against the fence, and not risk coming in contact with the blade. And if I've got the guards in place, I can't even get the fence over that close to the blade to begin with. Oh. All right, folks, where are we here? We've gone a whole 14 minutes, and my voice is fading very rapidly. So I think what I'm going to do, instead of continuing to subject you guys to this, is I'm going to try and take a few questions, if you have any. Let's switch cameras so you're not looking at my scrap pen. Cool. We've got people. So if you guys have any questions, if you have ideas you'd like to share about right tilt saws. Um, pardon me. Uh, having a right tilt saw, if you make your raised panels, if you're making a raised panel for some reason, or if you're beveling the bottom of a drawer or something like that, that's also rather problematic on a right tilt saw, because no matter what I do, I got to get the fence on the other side of this thing. So if I have a right tilt saw that is not a slider, and uh, my rip fence bar extends over to this side of the saw, I can bring the fence over there, but now I'm operating that thing on the opposite side of what I would normally operate it. So it becomes, if you're left-handed, it'll feel a lot more comfortable that way than it would a normal with the fence on the right side of the blade. So that becomes problematic. So another sort of drawback to choosing a right tilt saw is it's a lot harder to make raised panels. What I normally do is I have you would have thought I would have put it out there, but I didn't. I have a fence that has a big old rabbit in it. I'll see if I can grab another one, since I don't know where that one got to. That mounts to, this is not the one I use on the saw, but this would clamp onto the rip fence. I could then bring it over. Let's say we're making a raised panel that's 15 degrees or something like that, 25 degrees, because I don't feel like cranking it anymore. I can then bring this over and then make my cut this way. Standing it up, if I had a panel size thing instead of a rail size thing, rotate through there on all four sides and make my cuts. Again, rather problematic, because those narrow wedges are trapped in that tiny little space in between the blade and this rabbited fence. Now, the rabbited fence provides a little extra clearance in there so that it won't bind and kick out, but it can still bounce around and eventually hit the saw and kick that way. So safety is primarily the thing that I'm concerned about with right tilt saws. Of course, next week you'll hopefully hear me not as raspy speaking about left tilt saws, and I'll show you all the problems with the left tilt saw. Do you guys have any questions? I'm going to kind of come off to the side here and check the chat here real quick, because I don't think I'm going to be able to make it another 15 minutes here. I think at that point I'll be whispering to you. So if you guys have any questions, throw it up in the chat. We'll check it out. If not, I'm going to, I'll call it here shortly. I'll give you a couple of minutes to get your questions or your comments in there. See if we can't share anything. You don't have a slider and you have a Biesmeyer type fence. You could use left or right tilt by using the miter gauge in the slot on the other side and putting the fence. Yes, you could. So what John's asking, so if you don't have a slider, you have two miter gauge slots. You could move the miter gauge slot over to this side, have the saw tilt to the left. You could have the rip fence on this side if you have a Biesmeyer style fence, which is just a T-square fence, which is a box rail that mounts to the box rail that's on the front. And his question was, couldn't you just swap that and make the same cuts safely? And the answer is, to some degree. That's what I was saying, is if I could move the fence over here, if I had a Delta Unisaw, which tended to tilt to the right, and I put the fence over here, I could make all the same cuts that I do with this, or with the left tilt saw. I could make them on the left side of the blade and make them a lot safer, but then I'm working in an awkward fashion. The miter gauge thing, cutting this kind of a miter on the end of a piece of molding or a foot, or a, if you're going to make a box, uh, whether you do it in the miter gauge slot on this side or that side on a right tilt saw, is again personal preference. If I'm working on this side with the miter gauge in the slot, the blade is still tilting towards me. So if I have really thick material, that's a lot of blade coming at me. So I got to make sure that my miter gauge is completely clear of the path of the blade, and my hands are clear of the tip of the blade. So I'm moving farther away from this end in order to operate that safely. And then Douglas asks, why did they ever make a right tilt saw to begin with? Well, I can only speculate. I don't know what the real purpose is, the real reason. Certain saws, like I said, Delta Unisaws were originally uh, right tilt saws. Powermatic was always a left tilt, as far as I know. I haven't really studied the history of either, but all the oldest models I've ever seen, Unisaws tilted to the left. Powermatic saws tilted to the right. This saw, being a slider, tilts to the right so that I can get the miter gauge put onto the slider. And if I put an extension fence onto this, I can bring it over and make a zero clearance out of it. I've got T-track here that I can bring, I can put an auxiliary fence on there and bring it right over. And there's never a chance that I'm going to saw into this because the blade's tilting away. For these kinds of miters, to me, it's always better to work on the left side of the blade if it's tilting to the right, because, like I said, I can hold that material tighter, closer to the blade, and still operate safely. So that's, to me, why they made a right tilt saw, was because they weren't thinking in terms of somebody ripping beveled pieces as much. Now on a slider, more so than anything, the longer the slider, the less I need to have access to a rip fence. So realistically, if I have a right tilt slider, I have other jigs that I can put into the T-track in the middle of the slider here that I can set up to rip either parallel or to a taper. And if I have the blade tilted over, I can clamp this in place, operate the saw from this position, no use of a rip fence whatsoever, and just walk along with it. And I can rip off repetitive pieces on angles as often as I want and never have a chance of a kickback, or if anything were to happen, the bind, if it were to pinch in and bind on something, it kicks back that way. I'm standing off to the side, but I didn't want to. I love my slider. Not everyone has one. If you're trying to figure out whether you should buy a sliding table saw versus a fixed table saw, the answer is, if you can afford it, go for the slider. It has changed my entire world. I worked on a Powermatic 66 most of my career, and the minute I got this thing, the Powermatic 66 gathers dust more often than not. So there's just so much more that I can do safely on a slider that I couldn't necessarily do on a fixed table saw. You have to change your methods of work a little bit, but once you start to get a little innovative, there's a ton of things you can do on here that you just can't do on a fixed table saw. And a slider is not the same thing as buying a fixed table saw and then putting it either an aftermarket or original manufacturer slider onto it, because it's this section that is up against the blade that slides that gives you that ability to do things you can't do on a fixed table saw. I can rip from this, and like I said, the longer the slider, the less I need to use a rip fence. For me, this is about a, well, they call it a 31-inch slider, but if I take the miter gauge off of there and I put the ripping shoe on it, I can rip about a little over 3 feet, which for the vast majority of pieces of furniture that I make, the parts aren't a whole lot bigger than that. So we can do, I'd say, probably 75% of the ripping at the table saw, if that's the way I want to do it. Douglas says he has a right tilt unisaw from the early 90s and have always wished it tilted left. Yeah, I don't, unfortunately, no way to change that. Unisaws, it had to do with how they mounted the motor and how that then tilted. So on my Powermatic saw, the motor is off to the left side and it drops down and swings over, and that's why the motor tilts, the blade tilts to the left. On the unisaw, the footprint's a little bit more compact, and that motor is on the right side of the blade, and it drops down into the cavity in the base and tilts over. So, which is why it's a right tilt saw. And I think some of that was probably the product designers did it to keep the footprint of the saw a little bit more compact. I can't tell why, if that's the sole reason or not, but to me, that's the only logical reason that I can come up with, because that motor is in this spot and it tilts inside the cavity of the unisaw, or in this case, the Hammer K3, and it keeps that base very compact. Next week, I'll show you the Powermatic, and you'll see there's a great big plastic cover on the left side of my saw that the motor hangs out in, and then it swings down into the cavity as it tilts left. Charles says, I'm a sled fan. I'm a sled fan too. That's, like I said, most of my career I had a Powermatic 66. And, you know, the only thing I ever used on there, I mean, we used the miter gauge for some stuff, but generally speaking, miter gauges have a lot of limitations because of the fence length and lots of other reasons. A sled cuts down on the potential of kickback because the surface that the material rests on, pardon me, just like a slider, is in motion with the material that you're cutting. Where most problems happen for people that turn into kickbacks and other kinds of problems like that, it's because they're moving things across the fixed surface and they can't do it easily because there's friction involved and things start to move. There's a little, if it drags a little, if you don't wax your tabletop often enough, or if one of the Felder guys is watching, using the the Super Glide on the top because they don't like it when I wax my stuff. So sleds function better because the material slides with the surface, so you're not getting that extra resistance from sliding it across the table. All right, you guys, as you can tell, I'm getting a little bit worse here. So I'm gonna wrap it up. I'm gonna call it a night unless you guys have more questions. No? All right. Thanks for suffering through this with me. and for hanging in there. You guys are all troopers. I really appreciate it. Next Tuesday night, hopefully my voice comes back sometime. I really like it by the morning because the class had a really hard time hearing me today over the equipment. Um, I'd really appreciate it if you guys would come back next week. Tell your friends. Um, we'll talk about left tilt saws then, and hopefully at that point I can sort of tie the two sessions together and give you a little bit more. Uh, I'll do a little more demo stuff next week. It's hard enough for me to talk. I didn't want to have to talk over a table saw too much tonight. So I do appreciate you guys hanging in there. Thanks everybody, and hopefully we'll see you next week without any troubles and in good voice, and you don't have to listen to me croak along all evening. So thanks for coming, and I will see you guys next Tuesday at 8 p.m. Good night.